Good afternoon, and welcome to the WBC Faster Together LinkedIn Live series. I'm Gwen Young, the CEO of the Women Business Collaborative. And as you know, the Women Business Collaborative is an unprecedented alliance of over 61 women's business organizations collaborating together to achieve equal position pay and power for all business women. It is the first business movement dedicated to equity and diversity, and it is comprised of professional men and women, business organizations, public-private companies, and we are accelerating change through collaboration, advocacy, action, and accountability. By uniting more than 60 of the leading women's business organizations and over 430 champions, the WBC activates our vast network to attain immediate and long-term results around 9 essential action initiatives. The first 3 focus on executive women's leadership, and they are CEO leadership and sponsorship of women CEOs, women in the C-suite and executive leadership with P&L responsibility, and women in the boardroom, our subject today. The next 3 focus on the underrepresentation of women in business. They are women entrepreneurs and access to capital, women in capital and finance, and women in technology. And our final 3 are critical and underlie the rest for equity in business. They are diversity, equity, inclusion, gender and pay parity, and women in the pipeline. Thus, our work focuses on ensuring more women CEOs in the C-suite and on boards, a demand for gender pay and parity, increasing access to institutional capital and capital for women entrepreneurs, driving more women as controllers of capital allocation, parity for women in underrepresented sectors such as technology, and leveraging learning and development to drive pipeline promotions. Interwoven across every initiative is our call for inclusivity, diversity, and equality for all women, including women of color, the LGBTQIA community, and other disenfranchised women. Our collaboration and network is spearheaded by our staff, board, partners, advisory, and leadership councils. The WBC reaches millions of business leaders across the United States and globally. Our councils and board of directors are more than 34% people of color. And the power of combining the collaborative approach with our women's business movement is already creating momentum and accelerating the pace of change for businesswomen. Today, I'm thrilled to speak with Heather Spilsbury, the COO of 50/50 Women on Boards, and Bethany Crystal, the VP of Portfolio Partnerships at Bolster. Both 50/50 Women on Boards and Bolster are WBC partner organizations and participate in the WBC Women in the Boardroom Action Initiative. Welcome, Heather and Bethany.
Welcome. Thanks so much for having us today.
Thrilled to have you guys. And I was always thrilled to talk about where we're going with women's executive leadership. So we were just talking before this call. We know that the WBC monthly board report reports the number of women that were appointed to the boards of public companies. And so in October, that figure was 40%. So 40% of appointments to the boards of public company were women. And this trend has held steady for us sort of over the past year. I'd love to hear from both of you of what you're seeing across, private companies from the Bolster angle and 50/50 Women on Boards. What are these trends looking like? This 40% appointment, has it increased in 2021? Heather, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So just in case people don't know or they aren't aware of 50/50 Women on Boards, we're the leading education and advocacy group that's advancing women to corporate boards. And what we do, our mission really is to advance gender parity on corporate boards, but we also want to make sure that there's representation of women of color. So our goal is 20% women of color on all corporate boards. And we, like WBC, use Equilar as our partner to gather our data and information. And so we review all of the Russell 3000 corporate boards and the advancement of women on those boards. And I think in line with what you're saying, Gwen, we saw the same trend occur. So in the first 6 months of 2021, women gained 43% of the board seats. And that was a similar percentage to the last half of 2020. But in the beginning of 2020, it was a lot less. It was 37%. And obviously knowing our goal, which is gender parity and making sure that all women are advancing, it really has to be that women are gaining board seats at a much quicker rate and a much higher percentage to get to gender parity in order for that to happen. So it really has to take place over several years that women are gaining more than 50% of the corporate board seats. The encouraging news is that in Q3, 48% of those board seats went to women. So that's good. It's moving in the right direction. And so from our standpoint, I think that trend is continuing, and it's continuing to pace forward. And so that's what we want to see, because at some point we're going to have to get to 55% or higher for a few steady years to get to gender parity.
It's interesting. I want to ask you, Heather, we're also seeing that of the women being appointed, like 78 of the 139 this time, which is quite significant, were first-time board appointments.
Right.
So that trend that's an interesting trend. We're going to talk about how important that is.
Yeah, I mean, it is really important. I mean, part of that is that I think, and we can get into this too when we talk about is that pie expanding? I think it is, because I think companies are realizing that a woman doesn't need to replace a man, but they can add a board seat. And they can make room for women to then be part of the board and have that discussion, because we know how hard it is for people to retire or to replace people on a board. It's not an easy thing to do, right? Especially on corporate boards. It's a little bit different on private boards, which Bethany can speak to. But I think for corporate boards, it's important for them to look at their board composition and say, do we have the right people in place? And if not, how can we, make sure that our board's diverse? That includes women, that includes underrepresented groups, and then make room for those people to be able to have that opportunity to advance. The problem isn't that there isn't people in the pipeline. The problem is that there has never been room made for those people, because in some way, shape, or form, corporations have just reached out to people that they know to be part of the board.
It's a kind of network of who you know. Bethany, what does this look like in the private company space?
Yeah, so hey everyone, thanks for having me. I'm Bethany. I work at an early stage startup called Bolster. We are building a talent marketplace for executives and do placements for executive level project-based interim fractional roles, as well as board roles. I'm not surprised at all to hear about the high percentage of women that you're seeing as appointees. When we look at the board placements that we've done this year, 90% of those placements have been for some diversity. That's not just including women, but that is, by and large what we're seeing there. And we ran a study earlier this year called our board benchmarking study that analyzed 250 private company boards to see what is the makeup of the directors on the board, what's the diversity, and also what's some of the compensation details. And unsurprisingly, we're seeing a lot of the same things on private companies, even a little bit more exemplified at the earlier stages, unfortunately. More than half of private company boards have absolutely no diversity at all. And a large percentage, 80% plus, have only one token member of either a different race or gender. So we still have a really long way to go until we're at this 50-50 level. And then the one other thing I would point out is that when we also are looking at where women are getting board seats, I think it's really important to consider the role of an independent director, where we're seeing 3 times as likely women to have those board seats. When you look at investors and management directors or founders, it's only like 10 or 12% of those seats are held by women. So given the low numbers of women on boards overall, it makes a lot of sense that we're seeing a lot more first-time appointees, and a lot of the education that we do with founders and CEOs in our network is really priming them to help work with first-time directors on our boards. And this is something that we're also using at our own company at Bolster.
That's interesting. And Bethany, you brought up, kind of one of the stats we really track closely here at the WBC, as we all know, and we all do, it's sort of the women of color that are joining. So, our public data shows that for the public companies, that 37% of the appointees in the month of October chose to self-disclose their race. So, and that sort of seems to keep creeping up. The other interesting trend is lately we've had Asian Pacific Islanders making about 46% of the women of color appointments in October. So I'd love to kind of get both of your thoughts on what are you seeing for women of color? Because we know that's a particularly hard target, but an incredibly important one that cuts across both gender and diversity.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think part of it is trying to gather the right data, right? Because at this point, it really depends on who's self-reporting. And so those numbers are fairly low in terms of who is actually self-reported. Those numbers have increased over the last quarter from 17% to 19% now self-reporting, But I would say that the increase in people of color is occurring more with new directors, meaning that there are more diverse new directors joining boards, which is great news. Again, the self-identification part is low, and women are actually the ones that are self-identifying more than men. So we see more women of color identifying as opposed to men. Doesn't mean that there are less men of color. It just means that they are self-identifying. So, but I would say that that's encouraging news. I think the fact that people are appointing new directors that are women and women of color is really encouraging. And I also think that these women are probably more likely or desire to self-report because they're used to being an only and a double only, meaning they're the ones in the room that have been the only woman and the only person of color. And so for them, it's really important for them to report because they want to showcase the movement forward for women in their affinity group. I just think that, at some point we have to encourage directors, no matter what race you are or ethnicity, to self-report so we can have the right information. And it's not about trying to disseminate, the perfect number of groups on every board, because that is somewhat impossible, and it depends on the population and how many people are actually in the workforce. And that also goes into other, things that we talk about all the time, which is, are there people in the pipeline that aren't being pushed up and are just staying in middle management? But at some point, I think it's really important for directors to report that information, or the board to report that information, so that we can get a better sense or a better idea of what that looks like. But I would say it's encouraging for now. I mean, I think that the new directors tend to be more diverse, and so that's a movement in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, that's all very well said, Heather. And we're, again, not seeing a lot more overall diversity there. We ran our board benchmarking study for the first time last year, and we're running it again early next year. So I'm excited to see what the longitudinal data is looking like, and what of the companies that said that they're looking for a director, in particular an independent director, how many actually did so, how many brought on someone diverse, how many brought on a woman or a woman of color. So stay tuned for all of that. I can tell you that from our data last year, of all of the board directors, there are over 600 that we analyzed in the study, only 14% overall are women. 8 and 10 directors overall are white, and only 2% of all directors are Black at private company boards today. So we really do have a long way to go here. And some of the advice that I've been seeing in particular are really helping founders kind of lean away from that tendency to just go to your network first. This is the easiest way to make those first few hires and referrals. But of course, your network looks like the people that you spend most of your time with, and that might be people who just kind of already look like you. So there's this concept of quantifying your bias. That's literally looking at the people you're taking meetings with and making sure that you're exposing your network to the diversity of folks that you want around the table there. We also are starting to see some investors take observer seats in exchange for having someone else come in. We've done that on Bolster's board as well with some success, and we're really proud to have the diverse board that we do have today. So I think getting a little creative, and in particular making first-time founders aware that they do have the autonomy to make those calls earlier on, and getting that information out sooner rather than later, because the longer you go in your company's trajectory, the harder it is to make some of these really important changes.
It's very true.
Yeah, it is very true. It's interesting. And what you were saying, Bethany, too, I've seen people and companies do with people of different ages too, to try to get in kind of a younger person on the board and to learn about sort of how to be on a board director. But it leads into kind of, what can companies do? How can they build diversity on the boards? Bethany, you were saying sort of expand the network, founders do it early on before you sort of get entrenched in your career. Let's start with you, Bethany. What are some things a company can do to promote and continue to build a diverse board?
I mean, the easiest one is to make room for independence every step of the way. If you have a co-founder and you and your co-founder are both on the board, only one of you should be on the board, and you should give one of those seats to an independent. We saw a lot of companies in our study that were duplicating effort from people whose voices they're already hearing in their management team on the board, which is a common mistake, unfortunately. Another one that I would say is to just constantly be looking for ways to like be building out with diversity in mind. This has to be an intentional decision, and that has to start super, super early on. And then like building cohesion and inclusion on the board is really important. Our CEO, Matt, has done a lot to onboard directors, giving things like board buddies to new first-time appointees, matching them up with an investor with a lot more experience, making that environment as inclusive as possible. When onboarding new directors, everyone on the management team meets with them in advance, gets them up to speed. So we're really trying to level the playing field and make sure all those voices are heard. It's good to bring diversity around the table. It's better to make sure you're hearing from all of those people in an equal, equitable way.
Yeah, those are all great points. I mean, they're not too dissimilar from what we talk about all the time too, but I would say the two things I heard across our events during November for the global conversation on board diversity and our city state events was intentionality and accountability. And I think that that is the key to making sure that you have not only diverse boards, but a diverse work environment, because the two are so interrelated. And what we tell corporations all the time is that you just can't stop at DE&I, right? You have to make sure that if you're implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion across your corporation and across your board, that you're also then building some accountability, because you can't just assume that once you have a woman in leadership or once you have people of color that you've pulled into the corporation and you've just dropped them there and there's no more training or there's no more helping with their career and moving them through the pipeline to ensure that people are leading that are people of color, and then again, so forth on the board. So it's about making sure that that accountability continues, and it's a work in progress. What we heard from CEOs is that it's not just a one and done, and it shouldn't be. It really is about nurturing that talent, retaining that talent. I mean, we're all aware that people are leaving their jobs at a rapid pace, and especially women. And I think women are the ones that are taking on that role. And McKinsey has reported on this too, in their Women in the Workplace report, which is so great, which came out in September. But most women are taking on the DE&I role themselves, not because that's part of their title, but because that's the position that they've been put in, especially women of color. And so when you add on additional things like that, soon the benefits don't outweigh the cost. And at some point, you have to look at the cost of what it's taking for your employee to sort of take on that responsibility, or your board member, and say, how are we supporting this person? How are we supporting women? How are we supporting women of color? How are we supporting underrepresented groups? How are we ensuring that they're moving through the pipeline? And the same with the board, how is the board contributing in that? How are they contributing to the culture of your corporation? Because I think the two go hand in hand. So, there's things that we talk about like talent mobility, making sure that that's part of that process, and also utilizing your board to make sure that that culture is fed through the corporation and they're part of that process. Because oftentimes I think the board would come in and give advice for, the P&L and things of that nature, but I think that's expanded for them too. And now it's about what are you doing as a company to move this forward, and how are you meeting the needs of your employees, but also the needs of your customers. And so there's things that I think need to take place for those two to really come together, and for boards to understand the role that they play.
The last thing I might add to that is, again, just to double down on this idea of bringing on first-time directors and looking for people in a place that you might not expect.
Right.
We see a lot of interesting specs at Bolster, and a lot of people want someone who's been a VP of finance at a public company, who has a diverse background, who can also lead an audit committee. And the reality is there are just very few of those people in general, let alone a few who meet that certain diverse persona that you're looking to fill. And I think by getting a little more creative, you can actually find fantastic candidates from a variety of backgrounds. Our CEO, Matt, has done a lot of thinking about other criteria to look for in candidates. And we actually have there's a book that he's a co-author of called Startup Boards that, Gwen, I know you're familiar with, that will be republishing a second edition of early this year. That also has a lot of really good advice on that kind of thing. But I think first-time directors is a real asset. And a lot of times those folks bring fresh perspectives with new eyes because they just haven't seen the same kind of patterns over like everyone else has.
But it's important what you're saying too, in terms of looking beyond the C-suite, because that is also something that is important advice for corporations too. I mean, public companies as well.
Absolutely.
You know, oftentimes they get stuck with, oh, I'm going to look at the C-suite only, but really that VP level is something to consider, whether it's internally within the company or externally. But working with, you know, organizations like Bolster to ensure that you have the right candidates, or Latino Corporate Directors Association, you know, Executive Leadership Council, you know, there's many out there that I think that people don't tend to know about or tap into. And that's where they can find talent that exists, and talent that's diverse, and talent that has the experience that they're looking for.
So fantastic. And so in those groups like Latino Corporate Directors, ELC, Bolster, you all, this is what we're really trying to do, right? Is all kind of work together to kind of to raise that up. One more thing before we close it out, and partly because we're a December LinkedIn Live, right? So it's the end of the year. Is there, I want to give each of you the chance to close quickly on either something to watch for as we go into 2022, or you know, some sort of call to action type of thing. But what do you guys think about as we head into the next year? Heather?
Bethany. Oh, I can go. Yeah. I mean, I think the goal is to make sure that we're still increasing the number of women on boards, and also the number of women of color on boards, and men of color. You know, our goal is gender parity. So it's about ensuring that underrepresented groups are moving forward, and that talent is being recognized. I think the trend is going to continue. I think companies are aware that this is something that they have to put into place in order to succeed and even sustain their business, because customers are aware and are looking at what they're doing from that standpoint. And if you read the Edelman Trust Barometer, you know, most people rely on companies as part of their way to give back from a social impact standpoint. And so they're looking at them to sort of, you say, if I'm going to purchase something or buy something, that's a badge that I've said I agree with your values and what you're doing as an organization. And so it's really important for companies to ensure that they're taking that into account, including, you know, their key stakeholders, et cetera. But I think the trend is going to continue. I don't think we're going to slow down anytime soon, which is great. I do think that we have to remain steadfast. I do, you know, there are things that I think we have to continue to do on our end to ensure that trajectory moves forward, working together as organizations to make sure that we're building awareness for the business imperative of women on boards and women of color on boards is important. And I think that more people need to be aware of how they can also join boards. I think there are a lot of women that still don't even know that a board position is an opportunity for them, which is part of what we do at 50/50. You know, we educate women on how to pursue a corporate board seat or a private board seat. But it's really about giving them the tools to do that at every stage in their career to ensure that they can advance, because oftentimes they don't even know the opportunity is there for them. So that's what I would say for 2022. You know, hopefully we can look beyond that and get to gender parity quicker than 2030. But that's the goal.
I will keep mine brief because I know we're a little over, but I think the big trend for 2022 is a continuation of what we're seeing now, which is flexibility at the executive level. Just like you can get a lot of fantastic talent in your organization for an interim or fractional or part-time capacity, you can find fantastic people that are really easily accessible now, more so than ever due to COVID. And you can find people who can join your board that you wouldn't necessarily be able to years ago when travel was a consideration. So there's really no excuse to not diversify, and you can really find anyone that you need. So I'd say, like, consider that in your strategy.
That's exciting. It sounds like there's opportunities. So thank you, Heather. Thank you, Bethany, for today and for all the work that we're doing together. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this LinkedIn Live. We will be coming again in the beginning of the new year with a really interesting report on what it looks like at the boardroom, what the trends in diversity and gender look like. And that will be coming out in the spring of 2022, including all the work of all of our partners. Our next show will be our 2021 wrap up with our CEO, Edie Frazier, on Thursday, December 16th. Keep up to date and the progress that we're doing. Follow us on social media at WBC Collaborative on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, and have a wonderful holiday season, everybody.
Thanks, Gwen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. Bye.
Bye.